How do you do? I'm Arny Sokoloff from Continuum Aerospace. I'm one of the founders and co-CEO. What do we want to do? We want to build a better rocket engine, better hybrid rocket engine using some new technology. We believe there's some obvious needs that are waiting for a product like this. What are the immediate needs? Let's look at them. Here's two of them. Space tourism. I'm sure you've heard at conferences like this and in articles about the tens of millions, hundreds of millions that are being put into this industry, spaceports being built. But there actually is not a suitable engine in terms of safety and operating costs that's available today. Another area that was mentioned, microsatellites. They've been getting smaller and less expensive to build, but the ability to launch them has not changed in a long time. And so there's enormous pent-up demand, and a huge proportion of satellites are not launched. There's a number of future markets that we are convinced, as the advantages of our system is apparent, will have significant penetration. What are those advantages? First of all, there's simplicity. It's simpler by design. That means it's simpler to build, it's simpler to operate, and it's simpler to maintain. It's very controllable. Chief characteristic there is that it can be shut off as required and at the first sign of trouble, which leads into safety. Solid fuel rockets, for instance, in the passenger tourism business, they may never be appropriate. You cannot shut off a solid fuel rocket. Liquid fuel engines, they all have potential for a fuel oxidizer explosion. I think that's Spaceship One chose hybrid engines primarily for that reason. They are inherently safer. And our particular design, we believe, is demonstrably safer still. They're environmentally friendly. It's nice to be green, but there are a lot of advantages besides just being environmentally friendly for its own sake. It makes it easier to build, to handle, to transport. You don't need fancy environmental permissions to do these things. All of these items feed into life cycle costs. We believe our engines are demonstrably the most cost effective for the user. Who's the team who's going to be building these things? Well, let's look at the principals. So myself and Mike, the co-CEOs, we're engineers with experience in large and small organizations, 20 years experience each. Our chief financial officer is currently financial officer of a publicly listed biotechnology firm. And we have another scientist and two other engineers to round out our team of the principals. But it's not just us. We have an advisory board with some pretty illustrious names. Dr. Philip Lapp, who is one of the founders of Spar Aerospace. They're the people who put together the robotic arms that are operating now on the shuttle and the ISS. Dr. Robert Richards, who I believe is here, and he's a co-founder of the International Space University, and he also has an experiment that will be flying on the next Mars lander. Dr. Kieran Carroll, who recently had his MOST telescope launched. And rounding out our advisory boards is a litigator who's taught courses in intellectual property law. We also have partners, one of whom is Corey Klein, who's president of an existing hybrid engine manufacturer, and he more patents than anyone else in the hybrid area. We have our fuel supplier, who is probably the leader in the world, the best scientific team, and we have a unique agreement with them to pursue research and development on our fuel system. We have a number of academic partners, which are good for their abilities, but additionally, they open us up to a large pool of government money, which is available to joint industry academic partnerships. And we have a number of people who are with us, who are to the aerospace market. Building rocket engines is a pretty complex business. You need people with a lot of specialties. We have all these people lined up. We've worked with them before. You'll see the results of that, so that when we're financed, we can hit the ground running. We have a number of people just waiting to jump on board. What have we done? Yes, we researched the technology and researched the market, but here's the key point. We built an engine using the technology. Here's what a hybrid design engine looks like, and here's well, it's not going. Can you cue it back one and maybe get the the film going. Cue back one. Well, there it is. Anyways, it's okay. We'll move on to the next slide, I hope. Anyways, that was our hybrid engine. It worked perfectly, unlike the the slide there. It was designed for 1,000 pounds of thrust using our new type of technology, and that's exactly what it delivered. So what are the next steps? We're going to build engines in 3 sizes. Not only build them, we're going to test them repeatedly, and we're going to fly them. Here are the engines. One is a lab scale engine. It's called lab scale. You wouldn't fire it indoors, but it's necessary to be able to do repeated tests, dozens, hundreds of times will be fired. Then we learn about scaling up with an intermediate scale engine. And finally, there's a commercial scale engine. When I say finally, within 18 months, we will be firing this commercial scale engine. To put that in perspective, that engine is larger than the Spaceship One engine, the engine that powered the successful manned X Prize flights. Marketing. Here's the key to our marketing. We're going to demonstrate. We're not just going to show people paper engines, but you'll see on a rapid schedule, we're going to be inviting people down and to watch the engine firings. So we're going to publicize that, and the key thing is we bring them in early and we collaborate with our customers because we're integrating our product into their product. We're the engine supplier. We're not building the whole system. We're selling to them. Why aren't the large companies doing this? Well, their specialty, the large company's specialty is selling very large products to very large customers. At that, and we wouldn't compete with that, but they're not necessarily the place to develop something really new, really pioneering. A small, focused company like ourselves is more likely to be able to carry that off at a lower cost and better time. These companies will get interested once we prove the system. There's some existing hybrid companies. Here are the 3 ones that build the largest engines in North America. One of them, as I mentioned, DAC partnering with, but they have a considerable investment in current hybrid technology, and it's not clear that they have the resources or the interest to sidetrack into what is a new area that they're not familiar with. There's a number of non-hybrid companies that are of note, and I particularly mentioned SpaceX, and SpaceX is of particular interest just because even before they had flown their first rocket, and of course they still haven't gotten too far with it, they had their manifest filled. This indicates the pent-up demand for reasonable price satellite launch. Here's the development milestones. Obviously, it's too complex to go into any detail, but the key points is within 6 months after full funding, we're firing our small engine. Within 18 months, we have a commercial scale engine. The investor's viewpoint. We're looking for $5.5 million over 2 years. Now, this is a very small part of a large financial plan. I want to point out a few important points. There's basically an 18-month development cycle, then an 18-month commercial ramp-up. We're profitable in year 4 and continue with increasing profitability through year 10. This plan throws off $22 million annually in cash on year 10. And by the way, this is based on the Futron study numbers, which in many ways may be seen to be and yields an internal rate of return of 40% and some pretty attractive value propositions at the 5 and 10 year mark. So what's the exit strategy? How do you get your money out? Well, first of all, the preceding spreadsheets were based on independent operations. That means we sell hybrid engines to customers for a profit. And that's a good business, but our expectation is we become more prominent, and especially as we're dealing with larger engines and larger customers, larger firms will probably want to get involved, and one way may very well be licensing. The other thing that's more than likely is once we have proved the technology and the commercial viability, we expect to be considered a very interesting acquisition target by the large players in the space industry. That is the presentation. I'd like to thank you for your time. And I'd also like to say I really would like to meet with each of you individually to go into more detail, both technical and financial, on the project, where we wouldn't be, rushed in this 10-minute forum. Thank you.
Where specifically is the technology breakthrough here, or the IP? You just spend a couple of minutes on that?
I don't want to go into too much detail on that, partly because I would be more forthcoming. Usually we sign a non-disclosure agreement before we go into the technology details. But a key part is we're using a different hybrid fuel, one that is not the conventional, most common is HTPB, which was used in the Spaceship One, and I know that plexiglass was mentioned in one of the other presentations. We're using a different type of fuel, and which hasn't been used by a lot of outfits, really only been used in research testing. And that's the core, and a lot of other features come out of that. The simplicity comes out of that, the reliability comes out of that, a lot of the cost effectiveness comes out of that.
You should know, though, that as venture capitalists, we generally don't sign NDAs.
Well, we have to have different experience. Some people have been very willing. They thought it was a reasonable first step. I'm not sure exactly. We'll have to talk privately exactly what would be required to satisfy you, but we're not trying to be cagey. We simply are not interested at this point, basically pre-financing, in announcing to the world exactly how we're doing it. But I'm sure we can make some arrangements. It's always happened before. We've never not been able to introduce more details on the technology. The investor wasn't interested in making an arrangement.
It seems like you have the ideas for the rocket engine technology under control. Can you tell us anything about the airframes? Yeah,
I'm glad you asked that question. We have a very different model for our company. We're not building airframes. We don't have no intention of building airframes. Now, we may build a very simple rocket just for some test purposes, but our goal, we consider the passenger aircraft industry to be a more appropriate model for a mature new space industry. There's only a few people make aircraft engines, Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, Rolls-Royce, and they're huge companies, right? But they don't build airframes, right? And Boeing and Airbus, huge companies, they just build airframes. They don't build engines, and so on, and neither of those run airlines, and the airlines don't try and build engines. We think that in the long run, that the airline industry model is appropriate, and we are only trying to build rocket engines. We're not trying to build airframes, and that's why so many of these other companies, we're not trying to compete with them. We just say, take a look at us to be your engine supplier. We're focused on that. That's our area of expertise. That's what we're going to maximize the quality on, and we're going to produce something that will be better in your application than something that you will do when you're also trying to do everything else.
How do your recurring costs compare to the recurring costs of a liquid-fueled system? Or let's put it a different way. How would your recurring costs compare to, let's say, Spaceship One, that we have some knowledge of the numbers to?
Yeah, I believe the Spaceship One engine is largely reusable, or at least in principle, and ours would be largely reusable. In actual fact, will be less expensive just inherently. Now, the fact is the fuel cost isn't a major part of it, but it will be slightly less expensive. It's reusable, and it's also a simpler design, so it should be simpler to and less expensive to turn it around. And again, the fact that it's greener means all the handling is simpler.
Do you have, I guess, future plans outside of, and you did mention a few future markets outside of nanosats or microsats and space tourism. Are there any serious modifications that you would see to your primary product to expand initial markets potentially if space tourism isn't as big as some might say, or nanosats don't take off like some might say?
Yeah, the reason we are particularly interested in space tourism and nanosats is because those are developing markets. They're not markets where they're not married to existing suppliers. But we think the more traditional markets over time will become interested in our product. One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in that I think it has an opportunity for is replacing hypergolics for instance, on-orbit maneuvering. We believe that it probably will serve as a space restartable engine. Potentially, it's a multiple restart technology. And if you're at all familiar with dealing with hypergolics, they're pretty awful to deal with. If you've seen the space shuttle land, the first thing that happens is a bunch of guys in spacesuits on Earth come out because of if any of that hypergolic fuel has escaped, it's lethal. So I think that's one area among several. And really you have to look at segment by segment. This is why I'd rather have a longer sit down and look in each of the segments and see of the market why this may be a superior technology. I also think it has a, especially for small satellites for in the defense area, has a particular application because it can be very, very fast to go. You don't have to set it up days and months and weeks in advance. And I know the military really doesn't like that sort of schedule.
Just a very quick follow-up. So based on that answer, I would assume that the technology is very flexible. And by being flexible, it can be molded into a variety of applications on a cost-effective basis. Would that be true statement?
Yes, it would. It's a general type of engine. But, and again, we're building the engines much like the engine companies in the aerospace, in the passenger aircraft field. You know, you get the airframe specifications and the technical requirements, and you design the fine points of the engine to suit.
Once your product is developed and tested, what is the sales cycle? Can you tell us something about what are the steps? Who are you selling to? What's their budget constraint and so on?
Well, one of the key elements, I think, to keeping the sales cycle reasonable, since it's obviously not a fast sales cycle, it's not a commodity item, and they also have to integrate our product into their product. And so the key is getting them in very early. So we would intend to bring in all those players that we consider to be at all serious in the space market, and especially the new space market, to come in, see our demonstration engines, talk to them, show them the numbers, and to try and demonstrate to them quite early that our solution is very effective in their application, and then we'd develop it along. The actual time to develop would depend on a number of factors, of course, the size of the engine that's involved, and how close is it to the existing ones that we're developing.
Thank you.
Is there a chance of a competitive threat coming from Asia, Europe? Are there similar research going on there versus, primary focus here locally?
This particular technology, as far as I know, it's only been used, and I could be wrong, in North America. As far as we know, by the way, there's only two people, us and a university, who've ever fired an engine of this size with this technology. I know that it's been looked at in other places. I don't know that it has been. But really, what we are is to consider this rather than as a lab curiosity, as something that ought to be introduced immediately or as soon as practical into the market.